they came right yesterday.
They lost the linkage between what was in fact the military side of the structure and
People in England just said they like the
Our system yours is still
based on
requirements.
Folks, welcome to today's Crease Brownbag. I want to thank you for showing up today on the last Brownbag of the semester. We've got a treat. Three young scholars who are going to be talking about some of their research as part of the FMSO Crease Fellowships. And then also I want to let you know that the only two events that I'm going to highlight that we've got coming up is our stop day meeting at 10 o'clock on Friday. We invite all interested students as well as, sorry, 9 o'clock, what did I say, 10 o'clock? 9 a.m. I've got it right here on my, and it's going to be here in Bailey, so faculty and students, and this can be associated students as well. And then that evening, 5 to 8, we've got the Crease Holiday Party at the Runaway Pony. If you're interested in knowing where that's at, we've got that information. Today we've got three Crease students who are going to be presenting the results of their FMSO fellowship. I guess it's a FMSO GRA. And I want to recognize Ray Finch, who's here from FMSO, and our primary sort of liaison. They report to him, write their daily, is it daily reports?
Week.
And also Tom Wilhelm, who's here, also with FMSO. If you're interested in these fellowships, I've got the information right over here on the table, and I've also, it's also on the website. Just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the students. Arnold's up first. I've asked him to introduce himself and his research as well. I should actually get the projector going.
All right, well, I'll start while the projector's getting warmed up. My name is Arnold Ressin. I'm a Crease student in my first year, and I'm also a second-year law student here at the University of Kansas. And so my research was Russia's accession to the WTO and its impact on its domestic auto market. Sorry. Anyways. So the reason the auto sector is particularly important and triggered my interest is because of its impact on the world and the amount of money that it's able to produce. And as we've seen in the U.S., it was so important that we were willing to bail out the whole industry. So the impact WTO membership will have on the automotive sector is it will reduce tariffs from 30 to 25% immediately. And by 2018, it will reduce the tariffs all the way down to 15%. Currently in Russia, if you want to buy a Toyota, for example, you would have to pay about $35,000 as opposed to what we would buy it for here, $20,000. And so this will open up the market to foreign producers such as General Motors and Toyota. But the biggest issue, and as you can see, the market is set to grow exponentially. It's projected to take over as the #1 market in all of Europe, surpassing even Germany. And the projected growth, as we see, it continues to rise. And much of this is due to the growth of income in regular, ordinary Russian citizens and their ability to purchase more. And so the reduction of tariffs will mean they'll be able to purchase more foreign goods at a lower price. And the biggest issue that I believe faces Russia in relation to the auto market is that as the tariffs fall, Russians will be able to purchase more foreign cars, and as a result, they will stop buying the local produced cars like Ladas or Zhegovis. And it's been shown, and most people who've ever been in a Zhegovi can attest that the quality of the vehicle is not the same as the regular or Fords that we have here in America. And so Russian consumers will likely buy foreign cars instead of domestic cars. And as we can see, in the year 2000, the imports only made up 3% of the market. And this has been substantially increasing over time. And Barker McKenzie projects that by 2016, only 21% of the entire Russian auto market will be held by the domestic producers, like AutoVaz. So how is Russia going going to change their market position and make their cars competitive with their foreign competition, I propose 3 different alternatives for Russia. First, they continue to invest in their domestic producers and allow them time to become more efficient producers and be able to compete with the likes of Ford and GM and other foreign manufacturers. The way they can do this is by increasing the amount of investment in collaborating with GM and other foreign manufacturers to use the same technologies that they use in order to be more productive. Another alternative would be to adopt protectionist measures, such as, since they can't use higher tariffs, they can use creative ways, such as only taxing foreign cars. They've recently made a tax, a disposal fee, an environmental fee, and it only applies to foreign cars. And the idea is that in environmental concerns, since the foreign manufacturer can't make sure that the car will be disposed of properly, they have to pay a fee, while the domestic producer can avoid this fee simply by saying, you know, later on in time we'll take care of this problem. The third situation that I foresee, or alternative, would be to simply stop funding the auto industry and focus on the industries in which Russia has a comparative advantage over other countries, such as metalworks and other metalworks, as well as natural gas and other natural resources. While it certainly will leave the workers, the auto workers, unhappy, it will be better for the overall society to focus on things that they're good at instead of just instead of funding money for something that's not working. And this is a graph of where they're being made, and this caption says, "What's going to be Russia's Detroit? Is it going to be St. Petersburg or Kaluga?" And so this is just a demonstration of how many foreign manufacturers have now set up shop in Russia and are infiltrating the market. And so, I guess, before we get there, in sum, I would say, Russia's accession to the WTO opens up their domestic markets, obviously, and it leaves them at risk of the foreign products taking over the domestic products. And so, if Russia wishes to remain competitive in the auto manufacturing industry, they're going to have to figure out a way to become more efficient and produce a better product quickly, or else their market share will slip and, well, there will be no more Autobahns. So that's my presentation, and I'd like to thank Mr. Finch for helping me throughout this process. He was very helpful and even edited my paper at one point. I would like to thank the FMSO organization for giving me the opportunity to research this. And I know Professor Milichev is not here, but I'd like to thank her as well. And thank you to all of you for coming, showing up, and listening to me speak. I hope you learned something. Thanks.
Folks, I think we've agreed to sort of hold off on the questions until the end of the presentation. That's all right with everybody.
I won't be able to do full screen, but that'll work. My name is Amy Murphy. I am a second-year pre-student, and I just want to start by thanking FMSO for this opportunity. It's been a wonderful semester, and you'll see throughout this presentation how my research has actually evolved, and I still have a lot of questions that I'm trying to answer. But the title is Stuck in the Middle of the Periphery, Moving Beyond Your Identity in Ukraine. when I started this, with my proposal in the beginning of the semester was to research the Euro accession by Ukraine, and as I looked more into that, I started to realize that it wasn't happening. But so I began first just with the question of what internal changes Ukraine needed to make to accommodate EU criteria for accession. And I thought it's been about a 10-year process since they started initially talking about joining the EU, and changes have been made, but it's been a very slow process. So as I looked through the media sources, it seemed that the topic would excite people and inspire many people, and it was definitely a very prolific topic and almost a daily occurrence in media sources. So I also thought about the benefits that EU membership would have for Ukraine, economically, democratically, and humanitarily. And one specific area that was interesting to me is special needs population. And so I have some background working with students here at KU who have special needs, and so that was something I did last year. I did a disability policy analysis on in Ukraine specifically. So there were some interesting things that I found which I thought were important, that as Ukraine accommodated EU requirements, that they would definitely see improvements in these areas. Specifically, I'll start by showing this video. There's a lot, how do I preface this? There are a lot of ways that improvements have been made recently. Even in America, it's a pretty new movement. But in Europe, it's catching up, and in Ukraine especially. This is just one aspect. This is mobility issues, which is it just hits the surface. But this video they did, kind of interesting. Actually, you probably know Patrick Callan. He shared this with me, found this on a website, and his comment was, you have to be you have to be an extreme sportsman if you have a disability in Ukraine. And you'll see why. I won't show the whole video, but some of the accessibility options for Ukrainians are kind of treacherous.
Не надо, чтобы закон работал. Не надо,
He's
чтобы...
saying, I need that the law works.
Все вопросы по мере возможности.
They do have the policy, they just need to start enforcing it. And that's good news that things have been changing, but it's still not being very good implemented. So they have these places that are accessible, but they're not operating.
За все, что в принципе не существует. Где-то есть контроль, а где-то контроль не контроль, везде есть. Вот он идет поэтапный контроль.
So obviously this man does not have a disability, and he braves the ramps in Ukraine. So he says, I need to be lifted up, I need to help. And he doesn't understand what they're saying because the speaker is obviously. So it's basically there but useless. And I'll stop just after a couple more times.
Если пандус поставлен неправильно, с уклоном неправильно, его переделают. То есть сначала мы...
Alright, so they're talking about the law again. And how they do have, obviously there's a law there. It's 2001 is when it's, like the movement has really started, but even just because there's a law there doesn't mean it's changing. I have lots of pictures of handicap ramps just because it was a hobby of mine this summer when I was there. And some of them are pretty scary and as you've already seen, treacherous. This is just another example of the ineffectiveness of their policy. And so that's why I had in mind joining the EU, because this was just a small part of the benefits that come from joining the EU. They would have to meet these standards. And however, I soon learned that joining the EU, that question was a lot more complicated than I thought. I understand that change takes process and time, but it was hard to find what really was the roadblock. And I know those of you familiar with know that there's talk, but not really much action. And so I started wondering, is it an internal problem, a political problem, or a national problem? And some of the things I found out, it's not just the Ukrainian policies, it's not just the Ukrainian government. The EU also obviously has apprehension and has been creating kind of roadblocks themselves. So to be brief, I'll keep it going. All right. So the next thing I started to notice was the Euro Cup was in Ukraine this summer, and there were definitely improvements that brought concerning infrastructure, and the talk for Ukrainians were, because they had so many Europeans with the media spotlight on Ukraine, they were trying to portray this European identity, and that they were feeling European and accepting Europeanness, and as well as being accepted by the fanatics that came to Ukraine. And so I thought that was a significant movement, I guess, for my research, is just to see how Ukrainians were connecting with Europeans. And then this picture kind of has been an influence for me, just because it shows kind of the dilemma of Ukraine. Right now, it's basically the West is basically EU countries, and then you have the East, you have Russia, and so to me, that's basically, this is the visual image of my research. And a headline from an article that I read is, "A country caught precariously between East and West." Then this was another significant turning point. They have been discussing free trade with the EU for a couple of years, and it's just been talk. Nothing has really moved forward until this summer. But however, this summer, Ukraine Parliament ratified a free trade zone agreement with the Commonwealth of Independent States, and that was just quickly. It quickly was implemented, and now they have on the East. I didn't realize how much faster things happen when you have the East Ukrainian, or the East and Ukraine relationship than the West, and how slow everything is when you have that. That was the summer. This was from President Yanukovych's talk after the summer again. He said, "We are confidently moving along the path of building a modern European state. We are looking for a way to the community of developed nations, but we will never accept the integration at any cost, through loss of independence, economic or territorial concessions, and intervention in the internal affairs." And and so the last part's kind of like a warning to the West. But what I got most from this is that Ukraine has developed this European identity among themselves, and they have their own way that they are defining Europeanness, and kind of rejecting the EU standards that they have established for them. So this again is President Yanukovych. EU policy towards Ukraine should be firm and consistent and continue to insist on clear commitments from the Ukrainian authorities toward democratic values and the rule of law. So that wasn't him. That was Manfred Steins. He's EU representative. And then the huge dilemma, the roadblock is Yulia Tymoshenko, who's in prison and has angered many of the EU authorities. Yanukovych again, he addressed the need for a new social policy in Ukraine while speaking to the members of the Ukrainian parliament. He remarked that this development would be impossible without the introduction of European standards and legislation on the social sphere. He promised to move forward and resolve conflicts within society. So again, he has his forward approach. And ambiguities that they have the talk of progress, but that's really all it is. It's just talk. So Yanukovych, he can proclaim to be making progress and to extol European values, but as we've seen, it's not happening. So within the same month as Yanukovych issued those two statements, the Freedom House report published their findings and demoted Ukraine basically in principles of human rights, which was disappointing. Human rights and democracy. This was a slide from the Party of Regions election campaign. They had about 21 slides, and this one says Ukraine, a rich European nation, a rich European country, successful people. And that was part of his political campaign to take in that European aspect and incorporate it into his campaign. It was not mentioned in any of the others, and that's another story in itself. All right. So this to me was a big deal, where you had this obvious use of the term European and Europeanization, and it was found throughout the campaign used by Yanukovych and the Party of Regions. And I learned that Ukraine has realized its own importance, and it's aware of its own contributions that it can make by entangling itself from the outside pressures imposed as it attempts to associate and align its interests to one entity. Ukraine has uncomfortably tried to please both sides, with one foot stretched west and the other east. And I feel like Ukraine is now attempting to take the best for its own self and make its own, I guess, push forth its own interests. So in that regards, it's no longer pro-EU, pro-Russia, it's pro-Ukraine, and at least that's what it's trying to promote. And however, as we saw with the acceptance of the trade with the eastern countries, it is easier for Ukraine to interact with the East. And you have the literal, they speak the same language, but it's not just literal. There's many things, corruption and things that Russia doesn't place down requirements for Ukraine to meet that the EU does. So they have less restrictions. And so basically the questions that I'm left with are how Ukraine is defining Europe for themselves. as they are trying to put this persona of joining Europe and being a part of Europe, whereas Europe is not accepting them. However, I think Ukraine takes this to an advantage that Europe existed before the EU, and Ukraine also has a longer history than the EU. So the last thing I had, slides that I also had in paper in the project yesterday, but so I don't have the slides that I wanted to have in there, but from this book, they did studies and basically found that Ukrainians have a desire basically to be European, to move west, and I thought that to me was shocking to discover that, and just basically they're identifying themselves more as Ukrainian and not really wanting to be European, but to focus on Ukrainian or their national identity, and so that's basically. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, it is. And like I said, I still am trying to figure out what that actually means for Ukraine and the progress that it is trying to make, and what that will translate to in the future. So, thank you.
My name is Gloria Funcheon, and I'm a second-year Res MA student here at KU. What I'm talking about today is the Soldiers' Mothers movement in relation to the First Chechen War, the implications for civil society within post-Soviet Russia. So the inspiration for my research came from this quote from Maya Eichler, who said that the waging of war depends on women's and men's acceptance of their militarized identities as patriotic mothers and soldiers. And I find that this quote really emphasizes the way in which individual identity is the fundamental building block of larger movements. This, I feel, really gets to the heart of security, i.e. how individual subjectivity then becomes part of a larger whole, and how it is that this collective can then accomplish large things when faced with a perceived threat. So a lot of research has already been done on the impact of the Soldiers' Mothers movement on the government, but what I wanted to find really was what is their impact on civilians. So first, in order to understand the Soldiers' Mothers movement, we have to really understand what is Soviet motherhood. For instance, Stalin's program here was Mat Georenia, i.e. Designed to reward mothers who produced 9 or more children within the USSR. This is important because it really elevates childbirth to this national importance, to this very security angle. You can see on these posters here just how very gendered child rearing really was within the USSR. Women were expected to produce, good, strong sons to serve the military and defend their nation on top of working a full-time job, i.e. the double burden. So when we look at what is the Soldiers' Mothers movement as a monolith, and then we will discuss what is it internally. So first, the organization was created in response to the Soviet war within Afghanistan. The primary rallying call behind the movement then was to serve against Dedovshchina, i.e. military hazing, which we will get more into later. But the organization was formed in order to call on the government specifically for military reform and specifically to deal with this issue. In the 1990s, the Soldiers' Mothers movement had a lot of coverage within Western media, which really helped out with access to funding and receiving grants as well as international awards. And quite a few organizations developed during this time in the early 90s, but there are 3 main ones which my research focuses on. First is the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, second the St. Petersburg Mothers, and then Mothers' Right. Often within the literature about this subject, what we find is that Soldiers' Mothers as a movement is spoken of as a solitary movement, as a monolith, but this is actually really not the case at all, as we find that there are quite a lot of internal tensions within the movement. The first that I want to talk about is how mothers often feuded with widows due to economic reasons. Though financial compensation for dead soldiers was often quite minuscule, it was regarded more in its principle rather than in its substance, i.e. mothers would often argue that widows could remarry, thus they could receive financial support otherwise, or they could go and start their own family. Similarly, sisters were also held in the same regard, i.e. they could marry and start their own families, thus they were often expected to be somehow not as upset about the loss of their brother. The second internal tension I found within the movement is this shift from Afghanistan to Chechnya. So, as I stated earlier, the movement arose out of the Soviet war within Afghanistan, but because that was fought under the Soviet banner, it was theoretically justified under the name of socialism. Chechnya, however, in contrast, had no such guise. As with any new war, it's very common for those with a strong connection to a prior war to then feel as if their limelight has been lifted or stolen, which can definitely cause tension. And this was a source of tension between the mothers who started the movement and the mothers who joined the movement in the mid-90s. Third, fathers are very rarely involved within these organizations, I found. There were very few organizations that were inclusive of parents of soldiers or families of soldiers instead of just mothers of soldiers. But even those who were inclusive, had very low rates of male involvement within them. Third, I find, and this is quite interesting, is that suicide and Dedovshchina victims were often not included in the mid-90s in terms of how it is that the mothers played a part within the movement. There's a huge shift between mothers who were protesting military policies specifically, and usually just conscription, and those who were protesting the war in Chechnya. There's a huge distinction between these two ideas. Because the first necessarily argues that against the underlying socio-military issues, whereas the second emphasizes a need to fight more proximate cause of the larger issue. And this internal dispute often created hierarchies within the mourning community, and unfortunately a lot of the suicide and Dedovshchina victims were often seen as not as important as those mothers who had children who actually died within Chechnya or in Afghanistan. The fifth large internal tension between the movement is that feminism then, and still today within Russia, is largely seen as a dirty word. It's either conflated within USSR ideology, or it is seen as an import from Western elites with no real application for Russian women. Thus, Stonewall, by and large, really refused to cooperate with any sort of radical feminist groups within Russia. The final major source of tension within the movement is this urban versus rural distinction. Now, urban branches of Soldiers' Mothers organizations branches were often much more vocal about making direct challenges and demands on the government. They were much more specific in their claims. They often sought an origin story for their loss, i.e. they located a site of blame on the government and not on the Chechens for the loss of their son. Whereas the rural and usually eastern dwellers within Russia avoided this type of discussion of blame, and instead situated their loss within a larger and longer narrative of national protection and protecting the territorial integrity of the land. It was very uncommon for people to outright support the war in Chechnya, but rural dwellers generally focused on processing the loss internally and as a community rather than on focusing on making political demands. Okay, so as promised, what is Dedovshchina? It translates to this idea of grandfathering in. Now, the specific origins of this practice are somewhat disputed, but we can definitely say with certainty that the practice is very much perpetuated by the system of conscription within Russia. Men of age are required to serve for 2 years, which creates a very clear delineation between the younger and the older generation within military service. Thus, because the Russian military is not a professional army, there is less development and training of soldiers. Unfortunately, this type of practice is often regarded as inevitable within the military, seen as just part of one's acclimation within service. However, military hazing within the Russian military is often quite brutal. There are significant reports of extreme physical abuse as well as sexual violations. These are not at all uncommon. Now, finally, it's really important, and this is something I found is not very much analyzed, is that there's a very gendered discourse that surrounds the practice. Younger conscripts are often called sestry or sisters. They're referred to as mama's boys or as girls. And I find that this often tends to be overlooked. And in keeping with the theme of the gender analysis of my research, I think it's really important to highlight the fact that this is seen as a derogatory thing, that to be a sister or a mama's boy is something to be avoided within the military. Okay. So what makes the First Chechen War distinct from other wars within Soviet Union as well as Russia in terms of civil society? Well, first we can see that it was post-Glasnost, and this is really incredibly important because people could now come to publicly criticize the government as well as engage in these public debates about military service. Secondly, it was post-Soviet, therefore it was harder for individuals to find or grasp some overarching justification for war. Numerous Levada polls, 1994 to 1996, demonstrate that the vast majority of Russians simply did not know why their country was involved in this military campaign, expressing a lot of doubt and uncertainty. It was also pre-global war on terror, and this is another important distinction because prior to the universalization of this very omnipresent threat of terrorism, there wasn't yet a transnational or nebulous acceptance of terrorism as the root of modern conflict. Finally, what makes this war very distinct from previous wars within Russia is that there was a relatively small casualty rate, i.e. the deaths of soldiers seemed to be really only a concern to the immediate family members as well as very close friends. Chechnya simply wasn't on the same scale in terms of deaths as previous wars in the 20th century for Russians. Right. So what is it that prevented people from really grasping the reins of this movement, or why is it that this movement didn't grow to be larger than it was? First big reason I find is that there was a lot of fear of government retaliation, i.e. most people prefer to keep their qualms about the military private. So even if they may have privately agreed with the tenets of the Soldiers' Mothers movement, they feared acting publicly would bring them harm, and thus they avoided engaging publicly within this movement. Secondly, there was a lot of residual blind faith in the government to make sound policy, or there was just apathy about the government's ability to make sound policy. There were those who may not have overtly agreed with the military campaign in Chechnya, but they felt that they should trust their government regardless, or trust the military regardless, because they saw the military as something simply beyond questioning at the time. Included within this is the argument that even if the military was not necessarily a good place for young men to end up, it was better than the alcoholism or unemployment that awaited a lot of young men. And the military, in this sense, was at least a place to go. The third main reason why why this movement didn't gain more traction is because this idea of little mothers. And those were the women who would go to an office, or they would solicit advice from a branch or an organization about how to keep their own son from being conscripted. But they would not then, after that, once they were successful, they would not then engage in the larger movement to help other mothers with the same process. Okay, so I've isolated three main effects on civil society due to the Soldiers' Mothers movement in the mid-90s. The first one is this idea of the reconstitution of patriotic identities. And what I find here is that there's definitely a shift from a traditional militarized identity to one that's based on civic responsibility. And in this instance, Soldiers' Mothers emphasize the importance of making demands on one's own government and not just blindly accepting this sort of policy. The second part within correlation of this is that there was a conflation of military patriotism with disservice to one's country because it did not critically interrogate the purpose of military within society. And so a large effect within this organization on civilians was to just really get people to start to question, what is the role of military within our society? The second large effect was this idea of promotion of a legal culture. So much of what Soldiers' Mothers did in the day-to-day of their offices was to advise mothers who were seeking to prevent their sons from conscription. So Soldiers' Mothers organizations worked very hard to find legal loopholes and use the discourse of law as the highest authority rather than having more legitimacy than the military or government actors and what they may say. And really trying to find the discrepancy between what is said discursively and what is written about within the law. Some authors argue that if this movement can have concretely accomplished anything, it's the promotion of legal education and getting people to at least start to discuss their legal rights in relation to conscription. As a corollary to this, the movement also pushed really hard for the adoption of alternative service as a way to legally fulfill one's civic obligations. So the third and final impact that I found is this entrenchment of traditional gender roles. And this is where we can see, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And this is where we also return to Eichler's quote from the start, that it's very interesting to see how the identity of women is often conflated with motherhood, i.e. that being a mother is seen as the paramount experience of womanhood. And this entrenchment of traditional gender roles is a hindrance to the progression of the movement, I found. And that motherhood is certainly an identity which is relatable, i.e. mothers can easily work with other mothers to find a common ground of protecting their sons. This is something that is generally agreed upon to be a productive thing. But this unfortunately risks keeping the movement confined to just that, i.e. this inclusivity doesn't necessarily invite cooperation among different social movements. And this type of exclusivity can, in the long run, cause these organizations just to be far too narrow. So my conclusions are that within civil society, the identity of women remains predominantly traditional, i.e. women are producers and protectors of children, which Soldiers' Mothers is definitely in line with, though they have in some ways turned this on their head, turned this notion on its head and argued that the military is the largest threat to the livelihoods of their sons. The second conclusion is that there needs to definitely be a larger discussion of the role of women in order to create enduring military reform and not just continue to relegate women as protectors of life, but rather there needs to be a larger discussion and a broadening of what this could be. And third and finally, I think that there needs to definitely be a broader discussion of fear and vulnerability in order to reconsider the position of the military within Russia. This is especially true given Putin's military spending plan up through to 2020. Russians definitely need to become more involved within the public discussion about this, need to be more cognizant of how fear is used as a justification for military policy. Thank you.
But at least part of that is probably a racial issue. There are differences. For instance, many Colombians in Costa Rica, they're more educated because a lot of the Nicaraguan migration are from very poor rural areas. And the other part of this is, as nobody wants to remember, Nicaragua was a country that was destroyed in the 1980s. It was destroyed by war, and then it was destroyed by neoliberal policies that dismantled public education, public health, and public everything. So you have a problem there where a lot of the population that migrates doesn't have education, they don't have resources, while Colombians tend to be more middle